Hello and welcome to our virtual lecture on linguistic and awareness hierarchies. Before I get to the lecture material, I wanted to cover a few agenda items for some of the things that are coming up on our schedule. It's pretty incredible to believe that we'll meet one more time. Let's see, one, two, three, like three more times before the final exam. Yeah, things kind of stacked up pretty quickly here. So in any case, want to review some of that stuff that's coming up. Then we'll review the minimal pair lab and the phonemic inventory lab that we didn't get a chance to do in class. So I want to briefly go over that here in this context. And then lastly, just review some of the concepts on linguistic and awareness hierarchies in a short lecture towards the end here. Okay, so let's first talk about your quiz 3. Generally, people did well, but it's clear that we still have some trouble with some concepts, and I wanted to just take a moment here to review those. Now, remember that really don't stress about these quizzes. They're an opportunity to get feedback, right, about what you're maybe not understanding yet in a sort of pretty strict context. So be kind with yourself. If you want to see the quiz, sign up for a time to come see it. I hope to be able to provide it in class if we have time to do that and review it. But in any case, take it as an opportunity to make sure you understand the concepts that are covered there. Okay, so take it as feedback. Okay, but giving you sort of, well, I want to review two things here about that a lot of people kind of missed. The first is that we still aren't reading instructions very carefully. One of the questions in the beginning of the quiz had asked you to provide. It said, provide a singleton target that you would pick to bring the child to the highest level of complexity. The child, many of you did a really nice job identifying the complexity level on the Dinson typology. So remember that that child was at a level C, you might recall. But the point is that it was asking you to pick a target that then would bring them up to level E. Now remember that level E is stridency and laterality, right? You're introducing this, stridency. So you're introducing a new contrast. So just we can cover this concept more carefully if you like in office hours, if this was one of the questions you missed, which you'll find out. And I can tell you more about it. But the bottom line here is this: we need to read instructions carefully because certainly you all knew what the highest level was because you all did a really nice job identifying that it was a level C. So clearly you guys know what level A versus C versus E looks like. But you just had a hard time then picking a target that would bring the child to that level. So just make sure you're reading instructions carefully there. So that doesn't concern me as much as us missing some concepts. And there's one concept also that I think people are just over applying and sort of extending it to context in which it's not applicable. So for example, we had some trouble with understanding the distinction between stimulability and generalization. So I want to just, on this next slide, I'd like to take a moment to review this because it's a pretty central concept and it was sort of consistently missed on the quiz. So let's look at this. Let's talk about this in the context of one of your discussion questions. So this serves as two purposes. We'll review the quiz and we'll review some discussion questions that we didn't get a chance to do in class. So Garrett discusses sort of the process by which we evaluate implicational laws and their generalization. And in it, so this is one of your discussion questions, right? Talking about how we sort of design a study if we're interested in evaluating a particular implicational law. And so let's take this example. Let's say that you have a hypothesis that if I target A, whatever A may be, that it will lead to B, right? So A implies B, right? Just like we've already seen a lot of these implicational laws, right? A voiced sound will implicate or generalize to its an unvoiced cognate pair, right? That voiced pair generalizes to its voiceless pair or unvoiced pair. So we already know about these implicational laws, right? And importantly, we've talked about that these are unidirectional. So when we talk about implicational laws, we say, oh yeah, A leads to B, but that means that B doesn't necessarily lead to A. So they are unidirectional implicational laws. And they're called implicational laws because having one thing implies another, right? It's like saying, if you say you have um, a stove, that probably strongly implies your kitchen. So if you have a stove, you probably have a kitchen area in which it sits, right? So that's what implication means. So again, I'm reviewing this concept, so make sure you understand that distinction. An implicational law is unidirectional. It means that having one thing implies the other. And so Garrett describes in this paper that the way we can test this implicational law, right? So you might hypothesize that one construct leads to another. The way we test this is in the following way. The study should have an independent variable, which is essentially the two complementary sides of the law. That is to say, if you want to know if A leads to B, you need to also make sure that B doesn't lead to A. And to do that, your independent variable should be such that you have two conditions. You have A versus B. So let's imagine that you have a therapy, and you're saying therapy A will give me the stuff that we targeted in therapy B. So let's say that maybe you're targeting sentences. So if I target something at a sentence, I'll get gains at the word level. But if I do the word level, I won't necessarily get gains at the sentence level, right? Because that might be more complex. You could test that, right? That's an implicational law you could test. If a particular sound or a cluster can be produced at a sentence level, then it must also be produced at the word level, but not the reverse, right? So to test that, then you might have two conditions, a sentence condition versus a single word condition, right? So those are your independent variables because those are the two things you are manipulating. Then your dependent variable so what you're measuring or your outcome variable is generalization in each condition via probes. So you're going to probe for, right? You're going to probe for how does the child do in both sentences and words. So that's your probe. And you're going to assess that in each condition. So you're going to ask those children who got treatment at the sentence level, right? So those that got at the sentence level, what was their growth at the sentence and word level? And then those kids that got the word level treatment only, what were their gains in the word and sentence level? And that way we can say, oh, look, all of the kids that got sentence therapy showed gains in both sentences and words, whereas the children that only got words showed gains only in words and not in sentences. And that is how we evaluate. That is the process by which we evaluate whether this is true. That is the exact research design that you would employ to assess this particular implicational law. Now so that's one important concept that's important for you to understand, okay? So if you go back and you look at the papers that do this work on implicational laws and how one sound might imply the other, those papers should have this design if they're doing the right thing. Okay, so what we did in the quiz though is we started saying things like stimulable sounds generalize to non-stimulable sounds. That's what people were saying, as if targeting a stimulable sound implied that you must also have the non-stimulable ones, or that the non-stimulable ones might imply the stimulable ones. So maybe the better way to think about it is some of you were saying this. Non-stimulable sounds relate to stimulable sounds. You weren't even saying relating. A lot of you said generalize. Now I know what you were thinking, right? We've said in this class, and we read the paper that said that if we target stimulable sounds, those aren't necessarily the best because they're going to come in on their own. The recommendation was that we target non-stimulable sounds because those are the sounds that are really at 0% accuracy despite support and are not going to come in on their own, right? And so we've said, oh, look, this also fits in with the complexity account because in this case, we want to treat the most complex thing. That is to say the non-stimulable sound it's so complex that the child can't grasp it. It's at 0. Okay. But just because it fits under the complexity account does not necessarily mean that there is an implicational law in particular that says anything about non-stimulable sounds generalizing to stimulable. So what I'm taking issue with here is people's use of the word of generalize. It's not necessarily the case that if we target a sound that's non-stimulable, that we'll see gains in stimulable sounds. Imagine, for example, that you had a non-stimulable sound, like maybe one of the non-stimulable sounds was, K, okay? And then one of your stimulable sounds was R. Are you somehow suggesting that targeting K would implicate R? No. So again, it's just important that you understand that stimulability is just a recommendation for practice, that we should target non-stimulable sounds because those sounds, children simply don't have enough positive evidence, keyword, positive evidence of this particular structure, and they're not acquiring whatever that non-stimulable structure might be. So we're going to introduce that structure, but not because we think it'll generalize to anything else or it'll imply anything else, but because that's where we won't see growth unless there is therapy. Okay, so again, make sure you understand that stimulability and those recommendations have nothing to do with implicational laws necessarily. Of course, that isn't to say that this is not true. I mean, certainly one could examine this, but we don't have any empirical evidence to say that this is the case, right? There's no evidence to suggest this this generalization or implication. So be very cautious with how you talk about generalization and how you talk about stimulability. Be precise in your language, because if you say that non-stimulable sounds generalize to stimulable sounds, then I'm going to expect that your probes assess that, and they might not. So be really careful. Those are different concepts. Okay. Similarly, so talking more, what are some other implicational laws? So some of the obvious ones are the Garrett and Hulse ones, right? We know that all of these laws about a particular singleton targeting another singleton or implying another singleton, or we've talked about how affricates imply fricatives and all of this kind of thing, right? So those kinds of laws, like the ones shown in that matrix that you guys are now comfortable with using, I hope, those implicational laws are based on singletons or individual sounds in English monolinguals, right? That whole matrix is based on that research. So we know things like, hey, targeting B will predict P, right? Because that's the voiced pair, but not the reverse. So we see implicational laws in that context. See how that's different from the stimulability stuff? Similarly here with the Dinson typologies, there too we have implicational laws, but here they're based on features and contrasts, right? So and all of this is based on all of the world's languages. Remember that was part of what was powerful about the Dinson typology, was that we could look at what was consistent across languages and in a way to describe the sound system of each child on a scale of complexity. Right? And so it's important then to understand that these types of implicational laws were things like, if you had level E, that implies all of the levels below, but not the reverse, such that if you had level A versus B versus C, right, those levels would imply everything below, but nothing above. Okay? And remember, that is precisely why one of the examples in your lab where you were asked to come up with the level for each different inventory, you had one that was not able to be identified or with a particular level. And that was because the child was missing one of the levels in between. And you can't have that because this is an implicational law. So to recap this concept, implicational laws, we see them in the typologies because one thing implies another, but not the reverse. Similarly, Garrett and Hulse, one singleton will imply the other, but not the reverse. But with stimulability, we don't have anything that says that. This is simply a treatment recommendation. Okay? Okay. Now let's talk about, before I forget, let's talk about quiz 4. Obviously it's not ideal to have a quiz so quickly after another. You really only had 2 class meetings before then, and one could argue they weren't really class meetings because this is what we're doing, is doing it virtually. But sadly, that was sort of the way the class had to be structured. So I apologize, but it was sort of out of my control. In any case, let's talk about quiz 4. Just like with every quiz, this is the final quiz of this class. It shouldn't surprise you when I say that you just need to review the labs and the DQs. And when I say just review, what do I mean? I mean practice, 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 okay? We're at quiz 3 now, and people are still making mistakes like just not reading instructions carefully, or they come to office hours and they realize, oh, that was a really silly error. I knew that. Or just basic mistakes that you could have seen that gap in your learning, because it's a gap. You would have seen that gap had you tried to do it from scratch, So I really challenge you. If you want an example data set, email me. But you now have several data sets. You have Oliver's versus Sarah's. Maybe try coming up with an inventory or a minimal pair for Oliver, or again, just do active practicing, because we need to make sure that there aren't gaps in your learning, and you probably should find those gaps by practicing on your own and then asking questions. So if you start studying now for quiz 4, that gives you time to then set up office hours with me if you need to, email me questions, ask your peers questions, post on your groups on Canvas, right? Find resources. But if you leave studying to the day before the quiz, you're going to have questions, undoubtedly. Things are going to be confusing. And then what happens is you might just ask for whispers or gossip about what might be on the quiz or how to do this last minute. That's not what's going to support your learning. So I'm asking you to plan ahead. Look at your labs and your discussion questions since the last quiz and start studying ahead of time so that you know what your gaps are. Okay? Okay. All right. So let's now move forward and talk about the minimal pair lab that we also didn't get a chance to talk about in class. We're doing a little catch up here, which I designed in some ways. Okay. So with the minimal pair lab, many of you sort of had questions surrounding, well, you were able to pick a target sound. You've gotten good at that. But how do we pick a comparison sound? So I want to remind you what we talked about in your readings and in class. And I want to encourage you to think about organizing your data in this way for finding a minimal pair. So let's imagine that you've picked P as the target sound for data. That's not the sound that you should necessarily pick. I'm always a little skeptical when someone picks a stop. So this is just for this example. So let's imagine that you picked P, and now you want to pick among the remaining absent sounds, right, as the possible comparison sound. Because remember, we want to pick a particular contrast of sounds. So great, you've picked that target. What's going to be my comparison sound? So remember that what we want for these two sounds is the following. We want them to be new sounds, right? That is, we want each of them, what we mean by new is that neither of them are in the inventory. We also want them to differ along all of these features: place, voice, and manner. And then we also want them to be different by major class. So it's hard to sort of do that on the fly sometimes if you're not yet comfortable doing this kind of stuff. You're still learning. So what you can do is literally make yourself a little table this way. Say, okay, I'm targeting P, and here are two sounds that I want to compare it to. Let's say that you know that you maybe want to introduce these because those are also absent. And maybe these are sounds that bring the child to a level E. Let's say that would be a wonderful way to think about how to pick the comparison sound, right? Oh, maybe you want to introduce a stridency contrast or something, right? So you start introducing some sounds that are already apparent in the child's sound system. Maybe they already have S, so you want to target Z instead as the comparison sound so that you can introduce a stridency contrast. Now they'll have S and Z, right? You can get creative about how you target that comparison sound. But these are the things that you want to make sure you maximize for the comparison sounds ultimately. And these are, again, these features. So let's just look at this example. Let's say you took P and you wanted to compare it with K. First, you ask yourself, are these new sounds? Yes, they're not in the inventory. That's great. Do they differ by place? Yes, one is bilabial and one is a velar. Do they differ by voice? No, they both are not voiced sounds. And in addition, they're both stop, so they're not different there. And they're both obstruent, so they're not different by major class. So here you're telling yourself, okay, here I have two things that I've maximized here, 2 out of a possible 5. So this would be, that's sort of a score you can give this particular contrast. Okay, this has a score of 2 out of 5 things. All right, how about the next one? What if I instead targeted R because maybe you want to introduce a laterality contrast? I don't know, right? Let's say they already have L and you're like, hey, introducing R will maybe be a good thing. Plus I need to introduce this contrast, whatever, right? Great. So let's go through this table again. Are they both new sounds? Yes, they're both not in the inventory. They differ by place. One's a bilabial, one's an alveolar. They are different. They also differ by voice, by manner, and by major class, right? One's an obstruent, one's a sonorant. So this particular comparison, or this contrast between P and R, differs across all of these features. So I can kind of think about this like, okay, this scores a 5 out of 5. I've maximized all of these different features that the literature tells us are important, right? You did a reading for last class where we discussed minimal pairs, and or last week, not on Friday, we talked about syllable structures and sonority, but the class before that, where we discussed minimal pairs, we shared that the literature told us that these are the things that we need to make sure are different, because if we provide that space for children, we provide a more complex contrast, there we know that implies other things, okay? All right, so that's just one idea about how you might organize the data for that minimal pair lab when you're trying to figure out the comparison sounds, okay? Let's now turn to just briefly discussing the phonemic inventory and just a little bit of review. So with that, you were asked to look at Sarah's data. You were asked to organize, in particular, 1 and 2 syllable words, because that makes it easier. You were asked to organize those 1 and 2 syllable words by vowels. Remember, you had that chart, that big table that had all of the different vowels, and you were asked to sort of list the words that have those vowels under each vowel, so that then it made it easier for you to find minimal pairs. Remember, minimal pairs are evidence of a phonemic contrast. So if I say, what is the evidence? What evidence do we have of a phonemic contrast? Evidence comes by minimal pairs, right? And we've talked, so there's many ways that we've sort of talked about this concept. Minimal pairs, phonemic contrast, contrastiveness. Make sure you understand how those all of those concepts, are related. Okay, so once you had those minimal pairs, remember that we looked for a 2-time occurrence of a contrast. So if you wanted to call a particular sound a phoneme, what you had to do is show me that you had 2 pairs of words that were minimally different. So minimal pairs. I should have seen 2 pairs of minimal pairs, if you will. A total of 4 words per each sound, so that I could see that there was a 2-time occurrence of a contrast. And that is what gives us evidence of a phoneme when we have that. So ultimately then you put that, you should have organized that by place, voice, and manner, because again, we organize our sounds that way, phones and phonemes, because it makes it really easy to see the patterns in there, to say, oh, look, this child's missing all of these phonemes or all of these phones, okay? Just like when we organize our sounds by context and we look at initial, medial, and word final positions there too. Organizing our data makes it really easy to see patterns, okay? So none of this messy scribbling on a sticky note, okay? That's why I recommend things like tables, why I provide tables for your labs to really show you how important it is to keep just really clean data. Makes your life really easy. Okay, and so coming back to this, with the phonemic inventory, ultimately, what did we find that Sarah had? What phonemes did Sarah have? Now remember, a phonetic inventory, all I need there is to see any sound in any context, but at least 2 times. A phonemic inventory, I need to see pairs, a contrast, so a minimal pair, that gives me evidence. If I see 2 of those, I see evidence of a phoneme. So Sarah ultimately was left with 4 out of her 6 stops, a fricative, 2 nasals, and all 3 glides. We saw enough evidence for that particular child that those were the phonemes that were introduced, okay? Okay. And so then you could, on that lab, then you can think about, okay, which sound would I target? Think about your target selection ideas. Then after you have a target, go to this table and think about, okay, how do I apply this? How might this help me pick my comparison sounds? Remember, you want to make sure that you can get the most. 5 out of 5 is ideal. If the child has a really big, really nice phonemic inventory and there's not a lot of stuff missing, you might be left with a pair that gets a score of 2 out of 5 and another pair that gets a score of 3 out of 5, right? Because you simply don't have any absent sounds left to pick from. Then fine, then go with the 3, right? Instead of the 5. You want to maximize how different can you make them? You want to maximize. So you don't have to, it's not like you can't treat a 2 out of 5. If that's all that's left and that's the highest one, then that's what you treat, okay? So you want to maximize it to get the biggest gains, okay? So yeah, once you have your phonemic inventory, you can organize your data in this way so that you can make a minimal pair recommendation. Okay, let's now turn to the content for this lecture, linguistic and awareness hierarchies. So in this, I want to provide first a definition. Something we talk about a lot is prompting, but let's first start with a clear concept of what that is. Prompts are an instructional technique, such as instructions, gestures, demonstrations, touches, or otherwise, that we arrange or do to increase the likelihood that children will make correct responses, right? So what counts as a prompt? Things like just asking a child, what's your name? That is a prompt. You have now prompted the child to give you a response, right? So we've done something to increase the likelihood that the child will respond, asking them to set the table and maybe providing a guide, right? You're providing several prompts. You've provided a verbal prompt because you've given instructions, and maybe you provided some guide. Maybe you made a little figure to show the child how to set the table. That's an additional prompt to help guide the child to how you'd like the table to be set. Okay? So oftentimes, not only do we provide prompting, but we measure prompting, and we actually do more than just measure it. We manipulate prompting because we want to start therapy with often a lot of prompting because they're coming to us with the need of help. So we're going to start giving them lots of help and support to get to the right or correct response, and we're going to slowly decrease that over time. And the way we do that is over linguistic and awareness hierarchies. So what are those? We'll talk about. So we can classify these prompts, again, into a linguistic hierarchy, an awareness hierarchy, and a cueing hierarchy, and we're going to just describe each of these in turn here briefly. A linguistic hierarchy we can think about basically in this way, right? We're trying to expand the child's skill set or our client from isolation to spontaneous speech. In the context of speech sound disorders, right, we talk about, sound in isolation. You might just be targeting a sound just maybe in a CV context, or maybe you just start just by shaping that sound first in isolation. No other co-articulatory issues happening because you're just providing that sound. Then maybe you go up to a CV, maybe then you go up to a CVC, and then maybe you start putting it in a cluster context. I mean, you can think about what might fit from here all the way up to spontaneous speech, right? You might start at isolation and work into a syllable, then from a syllable to a word to utterance to sentence, and then sentence maybe to several sentences, and then eventually all the way up maybe to spontaneous speech. So that they don't need any prompting to just use in a fluid conversational context, okay? So I want you to, of course, this is a concept that doesn't just apply to speech sound disorders. I want you to think about how this applies to all of the contexts in which we provide speech and language therapy, right? This is also true of grammar. If you're going to introduce a new grammatical structure, maybe you're trying to introduce past tense ed, you might start first by introducing it with a single word, right? Just conjugate a single word. And then you might move up to doing that in an utterance, to a sentence, to all the way up to spontaneous speech, right? So the level of prompting you provide might vary across this linguistic hierarchy, right? Remember, prompting is what are you doing to allow the child to get a correct response? So if I'm prompting you with just an isolated context, I'm supporting a context, I'm providing a context in which you are going to be able to you're more likely to provide a correct response, especially if you're a child with a speech sound disorder. It's pretty severe. Okay. So what evidence is that this is important to manipulate? So we can take an example from interventions of grammar. Here, we do things like we have elicited production, where in this case, you are, let's say you're trying to probe for third person singular. And so maybe you set up a context in which you say things like, what does the mailman do? The mailman brings the mail. So there you're eliciting a third person structure because you're asking the child this question, which is very likely to give you a third person singular response, right? So you're eliciting a particular grammatical production. And so if you do therapy in which you provide prompting of this sort, elicited production, then the gains you'll see are in elicited production. That is to say, if I'm only targeting third person singular by eliciting that in this context with a question, like what does the mailman do? What does the teacher do? What is that, right? The child's giving me the teacher teaches, the mailman brings the mail, all that stuff. That's only going to give me gains in those contexts, so that if I then am in a spontaneous context setting, the child may not then produce that structure despite being able to do so in an elicited production context. What the research shows, though, is so elicited production, you see gains in elicited production. But if you provide recasting, right? So what is recasting? This is when a child gives you a particular structure, and then the clinician or the parent or whoever recasts the structure in the correct way, right? In the correct grammatical form. So essentially you're taking what a child's saying and repeating it back to them in the correct way. This type of prompting promotes gains in spontaneous speech because it's more naturalistic, perhaps. I mean, we could argue and have a discussion about the mechanism by which this might be the case. But what's clear here is that it makes sense, right? If you're providing more naturalistic type of feedback, you might see gains in a more naturalistic context. If you're providing more of an artificial type of prompt, you're going to get gains in each one. That's not to say that that you should use one and not the other. They're good for different contexts, right? Elicited production is going to provide a lot more support because you're sort of guiding the child. When you say, what does the teacher do? You're providing a noun, right? And a context by which they already have some semantic information. Whereas with recasting, you might not be providing that same type of support in an artificial context. You're doing it in a more naturalistic way, so then maybe you're more likely to see that. But what's the clinical take-home here? As the goal of intervention changes, from isolation all the way up to conversation, so too must the therapy approach. So that is to say, different therapy approaches promote different types of generalization. So depending on what the goals are of therapy, maybe you need this artificial context initially. Maybe the child does need that noun support and semantic support. Then you might start using this. But as you want to see gains in spontaneous speech, and we ultimately do, because that's the most naturalistic context, right? Then maybe you start shifting your prompting to recasting, okay? Okay, so those are linguistic hierarchies. What about awareness hierarchies? So this is, a lot of times with a lot of our clients, they start when they come to us at the bottom of the awareness scale, where they're not self-aware at all. They don't know the mistakes they're making, and so they require clinicians' feedback. As therapy progresses, we see them sometimes, hopefully, become self-aware, where they can correct themselves and monitor themselves. So they are aware not only of the mistake they're making, but also have the capacity to monitor that in the moment and even self-correct, okay? So that's at the very high end of the scale, right? So with a child, for example, in the context of speech sound disorders, perhaps, you do things like to make children self-aware, you have them listen for errors in others, or maybe listen for errors in themselves. Maybe you provide, there's lots of apps out there that also provide an easy way to record their production, and kids love sort of playing on the iPad and listening to their language after and watching their videos over. So, if you make them listen to themselves and replay it, that's going to promote some self-awareness. Or if you have them in a group setting, listen to what others are saying and then help them self-correct, that is promoting some online awareness. But ultimately, at the very top of this hierarchy is where they can just kind of listen and monitor and self-correct as they speak, kind of like you and I do sometimes when maybe you stumble over your words and you say, okay, let me try that again, and you repeat. You're sort of self-aware and can self-correct in the moment. And so what research evidence is there that we need to sort of support this? So in the context of speech sound disorders, this particular paper looked at children's awareness, or self-awareness in particular, at the second grade. And what they did is they provided, you can see this sort of scale, that they followed in this therapy approach. First, they started by having the child imitate correct and incorrect target sounds. Then the SLP modeled how you would score those correct sounds during conversation. Then the child records themselves with cues as needed to help them sort of be able to record their productions. And then they record themselves outside of the clinic environment, like in a reading or when they're reading or with a conversation with someone else. And this was provided, this step, you can see they're teaching them to self-monitor and to take it outside of the therapy room. They're really maximizing the possibility of generalization, right? And so what they're doing here is they provide steps 1 through 4, and they did that for 2 sessions to help children sort of master how you would do that. So it was just first like establishing the sort of protocol. Then children recorded themselves during unstructured spontaneous speech with a speech-language pathologist. And then data sheets were discontinued once the child evidenced high levels of success outside of the clinic. So they would look at percent accuracy across teacher and parent reports. So basically these kids were walking around with score sheets, and they were provided at the beginning. Every little one had a score sheet, and they were taught that when they filled out their score sheet, they would have some prize, and they got to choose their positive reinforcer. So at the beginning they would say, okay, when I fill out my whole sheet, then I'm going to pick, and I believe there was like a sort of selection of things they could pick from. And so they picked their reinforcer. And so when they brought back their sheet, they got that particular reinforcer. So if the sheet was completed, they got, maybe they had selected, I get 2 M&Ms. They get 2 M&Ms. I still can't believe that kids will work for like nothing, you guys, but it's the truth that they will do the world sometimes for a small piece of candy. Remember to ask for parent permission. Okay. So these kids were coming back, bringing their sheets. So there was also some positive reinforcement happening there, right? Though note that eventually the data sheets were discontinued. So it's not, you don't want kids to just be working for the data sheet. You want the data sheet to be a means to an end. That is, it's going to show the child the structure by which we monitor ourselves and what things we want to monitor. Oh, we're monitoring this sound, and this is how we monitor it online, right? And we listen to our speech in the moment. So that worksheet is helping the child gain self-awareness, but the ultimate top of that awareness hierarchy is when you don't need to monitor for that score sheet and you're sort of monitoring yourself online. When kids can do that, it's money. They get to level 6. They don't need that data sheet anymore. They're listening to themselves. They become their own little clinician. I can't stress the importance of awareness for these children. Of course, it's not always warranted for all children. That's not always the case that we want to promote awareness. For example, in fluency, sometimes we don't. So be careful, of course, but nevertheless, there is a scale by which we move up, and and again, this scale too, you can apply it in a lot of contexts. So some of these concepts apply broadly. Okay, another sort of scale that you read about is the scaffolding scale of stimulability. This provides also a cueing hierarchy within it, right? It's providing different cues to ultimately support the production of a particular sound. You read about the speech sound or the SSS, and you can find the English and Spanish versions on Canvas. I encourage you to look through those. Be familiar with those, and maybe even save them for your on your hard drive for the future. Okay, so that is another way that we look. So this scale is an example of that cueing hierarchy. Okay. So we've covered linguistic awareness and cueing hierarchies. And I want to just remind you that some of these concepts, these ideas about hierarchies and sort of promoting how different cues and prompts provide different types of outcomes, this concept we've introduced similarly before. Remember, we talked about motor learning principles. This is a review from a lecture about speech sound disorders in schools. So here, remember that there's a distinction between acquisition and retention. So again, if the end is just to acquire, that's going to necessitate a particular motor learning principle. If the goal is retention, if you want I want the child to not just acquire this, but keep it after therapy is removed, you might try a little different strategy. At different stages of the therapy process, we're targeting slightly different things. So it's not to say that one principle is better than another, but that each promotes different types of change, right? So we've talked about how different types of prompts will promote different types of learning. This is review. We've talked about this before, so I'm just throwing this out there to help you think about how some of these concepts link together. So remember, we talked about how these different principles some of them are better for acquisition, and some of them are better for retention. Again, just like with our linguistic and awareness hierarchies, if you're targeting and providing prompts that are going to help the word level, then you're going to help the child acquire a word level type of knowledge. But if you're helping them with a sentence level, then you're helping them with the sentence level. If you're giving them few sessions in short time, then that's going to be better for acquisition. If you're giving them more sessions over time, that's going to be better for retention. So you sort of have to ask yourself at all steps of the therapy process, what is my goal? And then do I have the correct tasks to meet that? That's why we're constantly stressing what you treat. It's more important than how you treat it a lot of times, because if you can figure out what the end is, like what am I ultimately targeting, then the decision of how to do it is really very easy. So focus on that. So we also talked about these other types of principles, similarly, the kinds of things we would do for acquisition and how they'd be different if we wanted to promote retention. Okay, so that's a review of a previous lecture. So Yep, that's really all we have on those three things. These are pretty straightforward concepts. Things move up on this hierarchy, and we can think about these prompting hierarchies sort of separately as linguistic ones, awareness ones, and even about how we might incorporate motor learning in there. Okay, so looking ahead for next time, you've got some readings that you've got to do for our class when we meet on the 21st of November on Wednesday. So those are your readings. You have, if you have journal club that day, you'll be presenting on those. Make sure you submit the article for your final journal club. When you write to me in your email to get approval, tell me what the article is, and then just remind me what your group topic is. Remember that has to be approved by this Friday, the 16th, okay? Also make sure that no one else in your group has that paper, okay? In fact, I'll add that right now. Right here. Be sure it is unique and that no one in your group has the same paper. There you go. Okay, so make sure that no one else has the paper, a repeated paper. Remember that it was important to make sure you picked a topic from which you could all draw a unique paper. So it would be sad if you all came with the same paper on the 30th, or wait, no, the 28th when you present it, and then everyone had the same one. So make sure you have different papers. Maybe you wish to post it on your group. That would be smart if you posted it on Canvas to make sure that no one else in your group had it. Then remember you have your SimuCase lab due on the 20th. That's submitted on Canvas. You have some DQs to write based on these readings. And then I remember that we have an in-class quiz on the 21st. And we talked at the beginning of this short lecture about what's on that quiz. Okay? All right, that is all for you all. That's all the content I have. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you when I return. Ciao.